It's interesting to me what games become controversial. Sometimes it seems to happen for no reason, sometimes all it takes is one 5 out of 10 review. But with Dragon Age Veilguard, it was apparent from its first trailer that there were going to be quite a few people who would absolutely hate its guts. And even if the more positively received trailers would temper that a bit, it was obvious that Veilguard would become one of those gaming flashpoints. So it's tempting to say that a lot of the negative reception is unfair, that Veilguard is a victim of unrealistic fan expectations, a victim of people upset about its stance on social issues, a victim of people who dislike when a series changes in general. But after putting 60 hours into the game and doing everything I could to meet it halfway, I think the answer is a lot more simple. In my opinion, Dragon Age Veilguard is a victim of just not being a very good game. Hello everyone, my name is ianbits, and in this series we take a measured look at games a month past release after initial emotional reactions have calmed down. The first video I did in this format was Metaphor, where I very much liked the game but wanted to honestly talk about its flaws. This will be a bit of a reverse from that, where I firmly dislike a game but want to outline what strengths it has that might be enough to carry the game for some people. This is not a re-review, and I think it's incredibly valuable to watch the official Noisy Pixel review and see what someone whose opinion clashes with mine thinks, because I genuinely do understand why some people like this game even if I didn't, and you might resonate more with that voice than mine. I cannot stress this enough, this is an opinion. I'll try to explain why I have that opinion, but it's still just opinion. Dragon Age Veilguard, which I am consistently tempted to call Dragon Age The Veilguard, is an action RPG released by BioWare in October of 2024. Development started in 2015 following the release of Dragon Age Inquisition in 2014, before being put on a hold in 2016, restarted in 2018, and announced that same year. It was later given the name Dragon Age Dreadwolf, which was a much better name than Veilguard, to which it would eventually change. There are reports that the game was originally intended to be a lot of different things before it settled on the final action-focused product, but it's tough to separate fact from fiction here. You play as Rook, a person chosen seemingly out of a hat by a dwarf named Varric to be the main character of a Dragon Age game because all the previous protagonists were busy / possibly dead. You've been enlisted to help him track down Solus, a party member from the previous game who was revealed at the end of Inquisition and in the DLC to be an elven god responsible for imprisoning the rest of the elven gods. He wants to do god stuff that's kind of tough to explain succinctly, which Varric is looking to stop because it will have the side effect of releasing a bunch of demons into the world. You successfully interrupt his ritual, but in the process Varric is stabbed and seriously injured, Solus is accidentally trapped in a weird prison space, and 2 of the elven gods were freed. With Varric's direction, you look to assemble a team to track down and kill the elven gods before they can essentially take over the world. Remember this opening, I have a lot to say about it, but we'll go over it when we talk about the story as a whole. I want to split this video up into 2 very distinct sections for gameplay and story. I don't always like doing this in reviews, but I feel like there's such a hard barrier between them here that it's a lot easier to follow if I do. There's not a lot of overlap between gameplay and story. The combat and exploration sections are firmly separate from the cutscenes and dialogue outside of random short conversations your characters have during downtime. Let's do gameplay first. There's a few aspects to this, one which I think is incredibly well done and one that I think is intensely frustrating. But let's start with the combat itself because it lands somewhere in the middle. I've seen a lot of comparisons to God of War, which I can sort of see, but it's significantly faster and has less weight to it. The closest comparison I would use is the more recent Assassin's Creed games like Odyssey, Valhalla, those ones. It's relatively standard third-person combat, dodging, counterattacking, occasional parrying, and a host of abilities to use depending on the class you pick. Class identity as a whole is a real strength here. There's a big difference between playing each of them in terms of their core skill set and the types of abilities they can learn. Attacking is fast and fluid, enemies move slow enough that you can reasonably dodge most of their attacks just from the animations, although I found that the window for parrying was both pretty short and the indicator for whether an attack is unblockable happens pretty late in the animation, so I ended up just dodging for most of the fights. Each class also has a ranged option, and I was impressed at how smoothly these were integrated even in some pretty frantic fights. It never felt hard to interweave bow shots in between attack chains and dodges, which is not an easy thing to do, and I think they deserve a lot of credit for it. Abilities are satisfying to use and varied, ranging from support abilities to burst damage to DOT, as well as an ultimate that just obliterates everything that isn't a boss. Each squad mate has a shared cooldown between 3 abilities that can support you, although these do considerably less damage, so expect the focus to be mostly on your character. Party members are also not controllable like previous Dragon Age titles. Overall, the combat flows in a pretty basic way, with simple attacks and dodges and occasional ability usage, but it's smooth enough to feel satisfying. Let's move on to the bad news and save the good news for later. The one aspect of gameplay that I felt was really disappointing was the level design. This is where I think the God of War comparison is more apt, and I really don't hold the levels in that game in high regard, which led to the levels feeling like a chore to get through as a result. They're mostly linear, although they sort of pretend not to be. After each encounter, there will usually be a chest or some loot hidden in the areas, forcing you to scour around for anything you can interact with or smash open. There will also be minor puzzles, although I use the term puzzle extremely loosely, as they amount to looking around for the glowing object you can use various squad powers to activate. These are almost never used creatively, and along with the mandatory loot check, just result in absolutely murdered pacing. The only difficult puzzle you'll be consistently faced with is trying to figure out whether or not you can access an area and you're just missing the path, or if you have to wait for a story quest to unlock a random door that will lead around to it. I understand there needed to be something besides combat in these areas, but whatever this ended up being, it's almost worse than nothing. It actively detracts from the fast-paced nature of the combat and the implied urgency of a lot of the quests you're given. I know this type of level design isn't that uncommon. In fact, the loot scouring is pretty similar to Mass Effect 2 and 3, but combined with the slow-paced puzzling, it just bugs me here. It makes levels feel like a slog and made me dread having to return just to look for chests. But hey, those chests were only worth going back for because of the good news, which is that this game does builds and build crafting as well as any game I've played in a long time. While the game doesn't have traditional stats like strength or dexterity or whatever, it does have a robust skill tree with a lot of pretty interesting buffs. You'll get your standard stuff like increases in damage or critical chance or whatever, but then more interesting ones like increased damage to close quarters enemies or increased damage for every arrow you have. There's 3 specializations for each class that amount to 3 guided builds, but you can do a lot of stuff in between, especially if you're not super worried about optimization. You can mess around because you like a certain ability and want to build around that, or because a certain gear piece has an interesting effect you want to push to the limit. And there's a lot of interesting effects to go around here. There are multiple copies of every item scattered in chests, quest rewards, and shops, and getting duplicate copies upgrades it, adding another ability and increasing stats. The final upgrade will almost always throw something insane at you, like giving you lifesteal if you have a certain buff, or making it so if your resources maxed out, you don't spend arrows when attacking with your bow. There's also unique items that can serve as interesting build-arounds and sometimes have double-edged effects. Your squad mates will also have abilities that work well with certain builds, encouraging you to swap them around depending on what you're running. All of this amounts to a system that succeeds at 2 very important things. First, the different builds feel like vastly different playstyles. On my rogue playthrough, the duelist build focused on poison and increasing damage the longer you don't get hit. The saboteur used items and traps that functioned on a cooldown rather than requiring a resource like most rogue abilities, and the void ranger focused on ranged attacks and electric damage. I also found it fun to do a suboptimal build focused around defense shredding and super fast resource generation, even though it wasn't quite as powerful. The other thing it succeeds at is letting you become overpowered. Balance is certainly something valuable in games, but I think in some instances it can be pretty overrated. Being able to do insanely powerful stuff through ingenuity and planning can be enough to carry a game if it's done well. This doesn't mean things should just be blatantly easy, but making something hard while allowing the player to figure out ways to completely break the system makes finding those breaks intensely satisfying. This is something Veilguard excels at. The item effects I mentioned are a good example of this. There's a host of them that feel weak or over-specialized, but even those seem meant to get the player actively thinking about why they don't need an effect like that and what type of effects they do need. It's a bunch of options while trusting the player to choose the right ones and allowing unlimited respecs to try again if their concepts don't work. This stuff isn't perfect, you'll probably be increasing the difficulty as you get later in the game, and I found the most fun parts to be tackling content I was dramatically underleveled for, which obviously goes away as your level increases. The acquisition of items is also a noticeable problem. Some of the best effects are locked behind the final upgrades for items which might not be available for most of the game or tucked away in a random chest somewhere you missed. This is something that will become less annoying once time has passed and there are more complete item location guides, but for now it's pretty damn annoying to not know where a crucial build piece can be found. These are minor problems though, and there's enough good in the build crafting that it might carry the game for some people, although it would carry the game for more if it didn't overstay its welcome lengthwise. I clocked in around 60 hours and it just didn't need to be that long. It runs out of anything new gameplay wise far before that 60-hour mark, as the later levels are spent mostly grabbing parts of the skill tree you didn't really care about, and item progression stalls as the game stops sending you to new areas. The gameplay as a whole is a massive mixed bag. It's got things that both nearly carried the game for me and nearly ruined it for me. And people with different thresholds for bullshit could easily just end up quitting the game halfway through. It might seem like a cop-out, but mileage is going to vary pretty wildly here. I have a lot to say about the story for this game, and I've struggled to figure out how to put a lot of it into words, so apologies if this section can seem a bit scattered. Some of these issues go hand in hand with each other, so there's going to be a bit of redundancy in my complaints. I should also mention again that these are all my opinions. I'm not going to do that disclaimer before every statement, but just assume that's the case. Stories are more subjective than most aspects of video games, and I can't speak for what you'll like, only what aspects didn't work for me. I want to start with the biggest issue, one that I think colors a lot of the story's other issues. In summation, that problem is setting, although more accurately the word for it might be framing. Dragon Age takes place on the continent of Thetis. So far the games have been set mostly in the south here, although going back all the way to Origins, this area in the north has been talked about. This is Tevinter, a place that has always been established as having a wildly different culture to the point where it's best to consider this a brand new setting for the series. However, the game does an unfathomably bad job of representing this to the point where it barely defines Tevinter at all. What you're given is a series of small pockets of civilization, but no real towns or cities. There are some shops, and one of the zones is called Docktown, but at any given point you're no fewer than 10 seconds away from random contextless enemies that make these areas feel like average video game levels and not real places. And this wouldn't be that big of a deal if it was revisiting some of the same settings as previous titles, but this is almost entirely new. There's no base of knowledge to work on here short of lore from previous games. The reason I think people say this game doesn't feel like Dragon Age, or one of the reasons anyway, is that without doing anything to define the government, people, and conflicts of Tevinter, the player isn't given the proper background as to why this place is supposed to be different from the south. There was a pretty obvious solution here, which is to make it so the player's character wasn't from Tevinter and could act as an audience surrogate. However, that's just not the case. Interactions between people feel like you're starting a TV show on Season 3. There's all this information they know and the player doesn't, and they have no interest in telling you. Compare that to previous titles which built upon core conflicts such as the one between Templars and Mages, and utilized organizations and governing bodies that you slowly learned about over the course of several games. Tevinter is just a horribly established setting, and in my opinion this is just an example of flat out bad writing. And hell, depending on how much you want to stretch the definition of setting, the setup for the conflict of the game is equally horrendous. When Solas's ritual fails, several things happen. The elven gods getting released is mostly told and not shown. You see these weird shadows before blacking out, and then Solas just kind of tells you that they escaped and they're super dangerous. These elven gods then take on the role of primary antagonists and weirdly also don't show up very often and are just tenuously linked to seemingly unrelated conflicts, which ties into another odd decision. Solas is an interesting character with complex motivations and who players have a history with, so to see him instantly sidelined for two villains with the depth of a puddle is bizarre. It almost just feels like they didn't know how to utilize him. He's absent for basically the entire game, and he's a massive missed opportunity. They had a chance for a hugely memorable antagonist set up for them and decided to go with two mustache twirlers instead. The main conflict with the gods seems unrelated to the missions you're sent to do. You'll visit locations that feel like they were designed entirely separately and never fully integrated story-wise, which led me to a general sense of apathy about a world you're supposed to want to save. This is a 60-hour game, and I just never found myself caring about any potential consequences for the world because they never did the baseline job of setting it up. It's also incredibly odd that your focus is so indirect given how often the game stops and tells you how dangerous your enemies are and how urgent the conflict is. You might think that the goal is to gather factions to help you fight the gods, but despite the fact that each area is associated with one, and there's even faction levels for each, that's not actually the overall goal. The reason for visiting these places is assembling a team, sort of. That seems like the goal for most of it, but it's not explained why it has to be only this group and why it even has to be your character that leads the way on it. In Origins, you were the lone surviving witnesses to a betrayal you had to unravel. In Dragon Age 2, the conflict was smaller and more condensed around a single person in a single city. In Inquisition, you were the only one with the ability to close tears in the fabric of reality. In Veilguard, I have no idea why Rook is the only one who can do this and why they barely even ask for help outside of the Grey Wardens, which might have just been because I picked that faction as my character background. There's no attempts to enlist armies or lords or governments. It's your group of seemingly random people who are woefully underqualified due to personal and emotional issues that you need to stop what you're doing and solve, despite the fact that there's two gods actively destroying the world. Again, framing is a big culprit here. Mass Effect 2 had a similar setup where you were meant to be recruiting a team to solve a problem no one else would, but it set you up as an outlaw, forced to work with a shadowy organization and unable to ask for help. And even then, at least you went to the council. You got shot down, but at least you asked. Here you just barely even try, and there's no real reason given why. No one seems keen to help despite the massive Zerg creep spreading throughout the land, and while factions do eventually come to help you, it almost feels like you make these connections on accident without it being the main goal. The game is in this weird space between the assemble a team setup of Mass Effect 2 and the enlist factions to your side of Dragon Age Origins in Mass Effect 3, and as a result, neither part is really set up that well. This lack of identity and propensity to emulate Mass Effect is actually a pretty common theme. The mission structure, level design, and even a lot of the mechanics like having primers and detonators are taken directly from those games. This isn't exactly that weird considering it's BioWare, but it leads to the game feeling more like a fantasy Mass Effect title than Dragon Age, and neither that nor the poorly established setting helps the game's overall lack of identity. Also contributing to this issue is the wild inconsistencies in tone. Dragon Age always marketed itself as a dark fantasy series, although it often just felt like a regular fantasy game that turned the blood slider up way too high. Still, it's worth noting that there were certainly darker elements here, and more importantly, a generally serious tone. And while Veilguard isn't quite as bad as its initial trailer made it look, it's still got some major problems here. At times it's on point, again mostly with the stuff involving Grey Wardens, which was the highlight of the game for me. Other times it's bizarre, like a weird underwater prison section and a shark mountain that looks like an evil lair from a 90s cartoon villain. The dialogue does this too, even when choosing the serious options, my character couldn't stop himself from making random quips. And the swings between that and seriousness, oftentimes mid-conversation, gives a sense of a game pulled in multiple directions. I honestly get a sense from all these problems that the team had their own ideas for a fantasy RPG that had to be unconvincingly smashed together with a Dragon Age game. And those ideas are sometimes awesome. That underwater prison section is legitimately sick, and if this was some random new fantasy IP, I would have loved the sequence. But within the context of a dark fantasy game, it felt like someone copy and pasted a random chapter of Harry Potter into Lord of the Rings. I would have liked to play whatever ideas this team might have had untethered from Dragon Age, and I would have liked to just play Dragon Age, but what we ended up getting feels smack dab in the middle. Every time my player character said something I didn't want him to, or that didn't fit the dialogue option I chose, I was left feeling like I was playing that vision, that game, not a game built around player choice. Because the choices here, while legitimately having impact on how the story plays out, can often feel like they're just there out of obligation. There doesn't feel like there's a trust for the player to guide and shape their own story, reinforced by how blunt the game is when you make decisions. Rather than simple approval or disapproval, you're told exactly what it is you just said, which feels wildly out of place. It feels like the game doesn't trust you to understand nuance. Rook as a main character feels once again like they're torn between two goals. While you're given freedom in dialogue, it trends closer to Mass Effect in that you're somewhat a defined character no matter what you do. But even there, Shepard had way more room to be the character that the player wanted them to be. He could straight up murk people, he could do whatever it took in the name of completing the mission. In Veilguard, the game is afraid to let Rook be anything besides a hero. No matter what, you're always a hero. There's barely any opportunity to do anything else. This is true from the very beginning, in which every faction backstory involves some act of heroics where you did super cool and badass things and then everyone clapped. It remains true throughout the game when even the bad options end up being just blunt rather than actually negative. This is a series that started with everyone being a bastard, with elves being effectively enslaved, with mages being imprisoned and brainwashed. This is a series where you can play a royal character who refuses to even speak to commoners and makes his attendants speak for him. Why can't I be an asshole? It's railroading. It's forcing the player not to be their own character, but to be the Rook the writers planned for, with an illusion of choice over it. There's issues here with your party members too. There's a few legitimately good characters here. Devrin feels perfect for the series, and his involvement with the Grey Wardens arc in the main story fleshes out his motivations really well. Emmerich is also pretty great, even if he, once again, feels closer to a Harry Potter character than something that belongs in Dragon Age. Harding is also totally fine in the sidekick role that these games always seem to have. She's not tremendously interesting as a character, but I don't think she's meant to be. Lucanus has his moments, and his voice actor stands out as doing a fantastic job keeping a somewhat wacky character grounded. The rest I don't have as much good to say about. Nev is just intensely boring. Even romancing her in my playthrough barely led to any moments where she did anything meaningful or emotional. Bellara is annoying, although I fully admit that might not be a writing thing and more that I just don't like characters like her. Mass Effect Andromeda had that X.R.C who was similar and she rubbed me the wrong way too. The big offender is Tosh, who is just so fundamentally unlikable as a character that I avoided them whenever possible. They're written like a teenager, and it doesn't help that a huge portion of their character arc is just about arguing with their mom. Their arc of realizing they're non-binary is something that I'm sure caused a lot of people to write them off instantly, but as someone who doesn't really care about that stuff, it still felt to me like the writers didn't trust the player to understand nuance. This is what should be a complex time for this character, and it's executed with the subtlety of a brick through a window. And look, even despite all this, you can see the potential here. You can see the potential of some sort of medieval fantasy version of Harry Potter, or a more compact action RPG focused on build variety. And you can see the talent of the team with the ending, which I can't spoil too much, but emulates the idea of the suicide mission from Mass Effect 2, and in a lot of ways does it better. It would have been amazing in a game where I cared about the world or the characters, but I just flat out didn't. There's glimpses of a great game here, and I understand why some people see them, but for me they're just drowned out by mountains of issues and inconsistencies. When I sat down to write this, I didn't plan on it being as negative as it ended up, but the more I thought about my experience, the less I found myself able to focus on what it does well. It's an uneven experience, a bunch of puzzle pieces from different puzzles. You can see glimpses, and I did. There were times, generally when I was experimenting with the combat, where I felt the game could have really shined. I was really enjoying myself. But you can't struggle with as many different things as Veilguard does without those struggles becoming the strongest impression. Dragon Age Veilguard was not for me. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, consider checking out my own channel where I do videos like this. I should have a video on East 10 going up sometime in the next couple of weeks. Also consider liking and leaving a comment. It lets me know people enjoy this type of content. I currently plan to do videos in this format at the start of next year on Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Infinite Wealth.